Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Great to see a lot of students and alumni joining us here. For those that don't know me, my name is Gabe Scheinman. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. For those of you that might be the first time being with us today or seeing this video, the Alexander Hamilton Society, AHS, is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit national organization that seeks to identify, educate, and launch young men and women into the foreign policy and national security careers imbued with the Hamiltonian perspective of strong and principled American leadership in global affairs. We operate first and foremost on college campuses across the country, where our student-led chapters host some of our nation's most eminent scholars and practitioners on U.S. foreign policy for debates. Our over 60 chapters host 250 events a year, and are now over 1,500 alumni are working across the national security and foreign policy space. If you're interested in learning more about what we do and get involved, you can go to alexanderhamiltonsci.org, and we'd love to connect with you. Today, it's a great pleasure to welcome as part of our America's Role in the World book series. And even though the book itself is not on that topic, we're going to talk a lot about that through the book's topic, is Jared Cohen. Jared is the president of Global Affairs and co-head of Applied Innovation at Goldman Sachs, where he joined as a partner and member of the firm's management committee about 2 years ago. Prior to joining the firm, he was the founder and CEO of Jigsaw, which he founded at Alphabet Inc. in 2016. And that role worked a lot on applying frontier technology to some of the greatest challenges that we all face. Prior to that, he was Google's first director of ideas and chief advisor to Google CEO and executive chairman Eric Schmidt. And before that, what probably seems like ancient history, but he served as a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff and a close advisor to both Secretaries of State Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton. And even if that wasn't enough, he's the author of 6 books, including his latest book, which debuted at number 9 on the New York Times bestseller list, and the subject of today's conversation, which is Life After Power: 7 Presidents and Their Search for Purpose Beyond the White House. And the book explores what happens to American presidents after they leave the Oval Office and tells the story of 7 presidents. And it's a great way to be able to talk about American history and American presidents' impact on foreign affairs. So, Jared, welcome. Congratulations on the book, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
So I want to start with some what I would call institutional and structural, but some might call parochial questions, because you actually open the book with a quote from Alexander Hamilton. And so it's actually worth starting at the beginning. So when the founders envisioned the office of the presidency, how did they also envision the concept, at least, of the post-presidency? Because by very definition, the concept was revolutionary. I mean, kings died as kings. Presidents were meant to die as ex-presidents. So the fact that there was even that concept was revolutionary itself. So tell me, how was this envisioned? What was the debate about?
Yeah, it's something that I really didn't quite appreciate until I delved into this book, just how limited the examples were for the peaceful transfer of power and the return to civilian life. And it's it had to have been daunting for the founding fathers, right? Because they were they were pursuing independence from monarchy, and then when they got independence from monarchy, they had to architect a republic that had the ingredients that would last long after they were gone, and they had to engineer something that really didn't exist anywhere in the world, which is, again, somebody being in charge and giving up power. And Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 72, I won't quote it precisely, but I'll just sort of paraphrase. He asked a very fair question, not rhetorically, but a question he wanted an answer to, which is, does it benefit the stability and the well-being of the republic to have half a dozen men who were elevated to the position of being chief magistrate wandering around the rest of us like discontented ghosts? And the founders, they knew that they didn't want permanence in power, but they genuinely did not know what to do with ex-presidents. And they toyed with a lot of kind of, clever ideas and some sort of silly ideas, and they left the issue unresolved. They debated it a little bit, but they left it unresolved, in part just in the stack ranking of things they had to worry about. They kind of didn't get around to this one. And I, for one, think, if we reflect back on that, the Republic was served better by virtue of them debating it and leaving the question open-ended, because we basically kind of winged this question of what to do with ex-presidents until you had the 22nd Amendment codifying the 2-term limit. And obviously Washington sets the precedent for 2 terms. But the fact that normatively each successive president peacefully gave up power either when voted out of office or when adhering to the sort of norms of 2 terms or the constitutional obligation of maxing out at 2 terms, made it much more ingrained in the republic's ideology and the republic's DNA. And I think it allows us, more than 200 plus years later, to remark that the very idea of ex-presidents is a feature of a democratic society, not a bug. And they didn't jam it down, the throats of future generations. They allowed it to kind of evolve, right? And it's still evolving. If you look at what happened on January 6th, like we're still grappling with this question of what to do with ex-presidents. We now have the only rematch between 2 presidents as the nominees of the major parties other than 1892. So we're still kind of, grappling with the question that Alexander Hamilton pondered. But I think that's exactly what the founders would have wanted us to do, is to constantly revisit these questions. It doesn't get resolved because we now know that since Herbert Hoover, presidents get a pension and, they get a library, and then normatively they get book deals and, take on some kind of cause and start a foundation. That's not good enough. It requires continuous investment in answering Hamilton's question.
The quote that you have in the book, as you said, is from Federalist 72, and Federalist 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, and 73, I think, are all the ones that actually deal with the concept of the presidency, which at the time was a hard sell. Because if you read them, Hamilton's very trying to say this is not like a king, right? Which is the concern he kind of has. Were the concerns about the office of the presidency itself different from the concerns about the potential of a post-presidency? I mean, you mentioned kind of Hamilton wandering people around like ghosts. There's also the concerns about the sort of ego and vagaries and beholden to a foreign power. I mean, are these different, or are these continuations of one and the same?
Yeah, it's interesting. I often wonder, had America been, inaugurated at a time where foreign policy, reached further and wider around the world, if the founders would have put more restrictions on executive power as it pertains to foreign policy, right? But foreign policy back then, it was a pretty limited scope. And you look today at the executive, powers of the president around foreign policy, they're extraordinary, right? I mean, I don't think in my lifetime you'll see, for the types of wars that we fight today, I don't think in my lifetime you'll see a president have to go to Congress and declare, war the way Woodrow Wilson did, as America was entering World War I. I just don't, there's too many shortcuts, right? And that's before you get into, executive orders and so forth. So I've reflected back on that. It's interesting. There was a moment, I opened the book in the introduction with this anecdote of King George III posing for his portrait and, asking his painter, who was pretty familiar with, the founders and the American colonies, what do you think George Washington will do? What do you think George Washington will do after, he's president? And, he asked it sort of cheekily, as if like he's never going to stop being president. And the painter, much to George III's surprise, said, I think he's going to go back to his, farm in Mount Vernon and live a quiet, retired life. And King George III kind of, smirked and laughed and said then that would make him, the greatest man who ever lived. And then he actually, despite being kind of mentally ill towards the end of his life, he came to actually develop a sort of frenemy, admiration for George Washington, who defied his expectations. And the George Washington experience is made all the more remarkable about the fact that he didn't just go back to Mount Vernon. He was dead broke. I mean, he spent his final years chasing down people who owed him money. He started a whiskey business, not because he was passionate about entrepreneurship or whiskey, but because he desperately needed the money. He was the most famous man in America. So he had all these voyeurs who would show up at Mount Vernon, which was in the middle of nowhere, and he would have to like board them and put them up and pay for them, which further bankrupted him. And so I think the founders, I think they worried about what a president would do with all of that power, and they wanted to curtail it, which is why they had the system of checks and balances. I think they also worried about a president not representing the republic, meaning, states and federal. They sort of embraced the system of federalism, which is why they have had the popular vote in the Electoral College and the bicameral system architected the way that it is. I think their concerns about the ex-presidency were wrapped up in their concerns about the presidency, right? I think that they were worried about, somebody getting all that power and not giving it up, and making sure that they put, checks and balances in that. I think that, for them, people didn't live that long then. And it's actually kind of amazing that, Thomas Jefferson actually lived to be 83, John Adams lived to be, 90. I mean, some of these early guys actually lived way past life expectancy. But, by and large, people weren't expected to live past their sort of 40s and 50s.
Right. You mentioned, so you mentioned obviously the ratification of the 22nd Amendment in 1951 that actually imposes a 2 elected term limit. Of the 13 presidents we've had since then, only 5 have actually become term limited, meaning they won 2 full terms and so forth. So of the 46 that we've actually had, including the current one, only 5 have actually ever been limited, let's call it officially, by doing that. So my question for you is, based on your dive into this, term limits, 22nd Amendment, a good idea, a bad idea? And how has the official constitutional imposition on this shaped the post-presidency concept overall?
So it's interesting. If you look at, let's take Germany as an example, right? Angela Merkel being there for so long in what is, irrefutably at this point, a democratic society, a strong economy, I think hurt German society in modern times because it basically gutted a leadership pipeline, right? And I think even these sort of dynasties within parties, like you could argue that, the same names being around the parties for a long time also gutted the leadership pipeline. And when you gut a leadership pipeline, it creates space for fringy activity. Right. And so I've always been a big proponent and admirer of us codifying the 2-term norm with the 22nd Amendment. I think it's a beautiful part of the American experience that that we allowed it to normatively persist for so long before we codified it. By the way, without a problem, right? I mean, the only violation of it that was successful was FDR's 4 terms, and by all accounts he's viewed as one of the greatest presidents in history, and so it kind of offsets the 4 terms. And because Truman performed so well and so unexpectedly, it ended up sort of not coming with that that kind of gutting of the leadership pipeline. But it's also true with the abrupt transfers of power, right? I mean, there was a precedent set by John Tyler in 1841 that the vice president becomes president upon the death of their successor. And, you had 7 subsequent presidents based on that Tyler precedent, the last of which was Lyndon Johnson, become the president as opposed to the acting president based on a precedent set by Tyler in 1841 that's not codified until you have the 25th Amendment ratified in 1967. To me, these amendments are so much more credible and such a more powerful feature of our democracy when they come on the heels of such normative repetition, right? And so I think the way that it's worked out, now we'd be talking differently if it went in a different direction. But by and large, we've kind of winged this question of what to do with ex-presidents. The only, the only kind of disasters that I would say prior to, the only disasters that I would say is John Tyler defecting from the Union, at the onset of Civil War, and getting elected to the Confederate House of Representatives. He died before he took his seat. And Franklin Pierce, after an attempt to rally the ex-presidents to, thwart the Civil War, essentially becoming a New Hampshire Democrat who was sort of a Confederate sympathizer and correspondent of Jefferson Davis and of course, January 6th. But by and large, it's been a good story, with these sort of notable exceptions.
I was kind of struck, I know it sounds silly, but I was sort of struck that in the subtitle of the book, it's 7 presidents and their search for purpose, not their search for power.
Yes.
After their presidency. And to your point, meaning I think there was in total, there's been, you probably correct my history, there's 5 or 6 or maybe 7 presidents that have tried to run again, most of which obviously unsuccessful, except for Grover Cleveland. So disaggregate us a little bit, the difference between search for purpose and search for power. And am I being unfair or too negative about the human nature of man to assume that the search for power is actually what they're most interested in and they settle on purpose, or there's something remarkable about the American system such that actually this is what you should expect?
Well, the reason I decided to focus on purpose, not power, is one, I didn't want to do a ranking of ex-presidents. What I was interested in tackling in this book is this elusive question of what do we do next? And we typically look at CEO case studies and athlete case studies and so forth, but we don't look at the presidency. Why? Because they're seemingly unrelatable to the rest of us. But it's the most dramatic retirement and transition in the world, but it's harder for them to top what they did last than anyone else. And the way I interviewed George W. Bush for about 8 hours on the record for this book, it was the longest interview he's given about his post-presidency. And his view is, look, you can't long for what you can't have. When it's over, right? You can long for lots of things, but you can't get, especially if you serve 2 terms, you can't get that power back. Right? And by the way, even if you come back for a second term, you can't get the power back that you got with the first term because you're sort of a lame duck from day one, right? So it's but you cannot get that same level of power back that you get in your first 100 days in your first term. Now, several presidents have tried it, right? So Martin Van Buren tries to come back for a non-consecutive second term or second presidency in 1836 as a free soiler, that he doesn't get any momentum. Millard Fillmore tries to do it as a know-nothing in 1856. That goes nowhere. I think the one that's interesting and was a real challenge to the system was Ulysses Grant, the most famous man in America at his time, had already served 2 terms. His presidency was sort of corrupt and a disaster, so he went to Europe, gave some speeches, but then he tries to run for a non-consecutive third term, or it's really a non-consecutive second presidency in 1880, right? And on paper, like, he should have, breezed through the process. And by the way, whoever was the Republican was going to win. A Democrat hadn't been elected since 1856, and so Grant tries. He goes to the convention in 1880. And he loses on the 34th ballot to James Garfield, who wasn't even running for president, who showed up as the campaign manager for Governor Sherman of Ohio, who was running in 3rd place. And on the 34th ballot, someone chants, "We want Garfield," and Garfield jumps up on stage trying to prevent his nomination, and he ends up with the nomination, and Grant ends up not being the Republican nominee for president. Theodore Roosevelt tries to make a comeback. First as a Republican in 1912, then he storms out of the convention, forms a new party, nicknamed the Bull Moose, and he ends up getting way more votes and electoral votes than the Republican. Taft splits the vote. Woodrow Wilson ends up with 2 terms as president. Herbert Hoover contemplates. Oh, and by the way, TR also contemplates a return again in 1916 as a progressive. And decides not to allow himself to be nominated. I believe that had he not died in 1919, he would have been the Republican nominee for president. And you would have had a very different, it was a foregone conclusion that he would have gotten it. He would have almost certainly won. So that's an interesting counterfactual. And then Herbert Hoover contemplates a return in 1936 and contemplates a return in 1940, but he can't bring himself to formally submit himself to running, and so he never gains momentum. This question of purpose versus power, I think, is very important. If I look at the 7 presidents I wrote about, Thomas Jefferson, John Quincy Adams, Grover Cleveland, William Howard Taft, Herbert Hoover, Jimmy Carter, and George W. Bush, each one of them has something that they are deeply, deeply principled about. In some cases, they knew what it was going into the post-presidency. In some cases, they meandered around and eventually discovered it. We can kind of dig into that. But once they discovered it, or once they knew what it was, they doubled down on it. And that's why their sort of post-presidency, ended up being, incredibly, incredibly purposeful. I think the ex-presidents that kind of miss power or are nostalgic for power or trying to get it back in some way without purpose, they've struggled, or they've had kind of unpleasant, post-presidencies, or kind of sad post-presidencies. And so it's interesting. And look, I think Hoover's story is very interesting because, when he's voted out of office in 1932, and is in 12 years of self-imposed political exile under FDR, he wrestles with the vanity of getting back the office that he lost, recovering his good name, and going after what he actually wants, which is a platform to be the great humanitarian again, a platform to be a great executive again, and that bipartisan status that allows him to kind of guide the republic. And it's only in 1940 when he finally decides he's done with politics, and never going to try to win the presidency, that he unburdens himself from the idea of running for office, that he focuses on the thing that he actually cares about, which is being of service to the nation. And then that's when he's resurrected by Truman and once again achieves his status of great humanitarian by feeding the world after World War II, the same way he did after World War I, by achieving his status as a great executive, by reorganizing the executive branch under, both a Democrat president Truman and a Republican president Eisenhower. And this final act of public service in 1960, Joe Kennedy, JFK's father, calls upon him to reconcile the defeated Richard Nixon and JFK at the height of the Cold War to show bipartisan unity. And he actually, ironically, recovers his good name in his lifetime. It gets trampled upon again posthumously, but in his lifetime, the name Herbert Hoover actually means something again.
And I think this is true, is that other than Jimmy Carter, Herbert Hoover is the second longest post-presidency in terms of number of years. I think that's right.
Yeah, so Hoover was 32 years old. Carter, I think, has actually crossed the 43-year threshold, or is pretty close to it.
So we've had 46 presidents, 8 died in office, 1's the current one. And then I think I looked it up. There's another 4 that after leaving office, they didn't even live for their next presidential election, basically. So of let's say the 33 that actually had a post-presidency to speak of, why these 7, the ones you just, and then we'll go into some of them individually.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I didn't know who I was going to write about. I wrote, my last book was What Happens When Presidents Die in Office. It was like a real childhood passion. When the book was done, I didn't know what I wanted to write about. And I sort of got curious about this question of what happened, what about the ones who survived? And, I grew up sort of fascinated by, ex-presidents. For me as a kid, they were the most famous people in America, right? Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, eventually Bill Clinton. I mean, I was sort of fascinated by them. And I always wanted to meet them as a kid, and so I decided to kind of I pulled a bunch of biographies off my shelf. And I was just curious, what's been written about the post-presidency? Is it even interesting? And I realized, I had actually stopped highlighting my books after the presidency was done. So I didn't really know that much about the post-presidency. And as I sort of started to delve into it with some of the early presidents, I was a little disappointed because I was finding the post-presidency pretty uneventful and boring, right? Washington's was kind of tragic. John Adams spent his post-presidency kind of blind and deaf and miserable and trying to settle old scores. And the only bright spot was his reconciliation with Jefferson. But even that, I think it meant more to him than it did Jefferson. James Madison and James Monroe kind of piggybacked onto Thomas Jefferson's, side hustle. A bunch of them, like Andrew Jackson and Harry Truman, kind of hung out at hotels or whatever, kind of enjoying the celebrity of it. I talked about some of the disasters already. So it wasn't a very interesting story. And where I netted out is, I'll tell you, I wrote about these 7 because they were the only 7 that I found purposeful. And they were the only 7 that I thought were worth writing about, right? I think, people they said, why not Ulysses Grant? He wrote that he was the first president to really write the memoir on being president. But what they missed from that is the reason he did it is he was broke and he needed money. And it's kind of the only thing, he didn't do it out of a sense of purpose. And we're grateful for his 2-volume, memoir. It's kind of the gold standard that other presidents follow, but his post-presidency lacked that sense of purpose. It actually was filled with alcoholism and, financial troubles and bitterness and, a very public battle with cancer. People ask me about Richard Nixon, and you compare and contrast 2 fallen men, Herbert Hoover and Richard Nixon. And I think Herbert Hoover's story of recovery is so much more purposeful than Nixon's, which I think is much more about vanity and legacy. People ask me about Bill Clinton, and I think that Bill Clinton has done more than any other active living president to invest in his legacy And yet, despite all those efforts, the norms have made his post-presidency and his name age poorly against time. People ask me about Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, I think his ex-presidency was a quest to get power back, right? His pre-presidency and his presidency were extraordinary, but in his post-presidency, he splits his own party. He very weirdly tries to raise a cavalry to fight on horses in World War One. He does some good things, but his post-presidency lacked that sense of purpose. And so, I wrote about the seven that I thought were really governed by purpose, and they also just kind of a little bit of qualitative intervention on my part. This question of what to do next has no uniform blueprint, and what I found with each of the seven of them, they all answered the question of how do I do what's next in very different ways. So Thomas Jefferson is that chapter, and I organized the book with each chapter being a different model. So the Thomas Jefferson model is for the serial entrepreneur. The John Quincy Adams chapter is for people who want to have a second act, but they don't know what the cause is or the purpose is yet. For people who want to make a comeback, they look at Grover Cleveland. For people who have deferred a dream because the timing wasn't right or the circumstances weren't right, the William Howard Taft chapter is a story that shows that a dream deferred can still be a dream that's achieved. Herbert Hoover chapter is a story of how one recovers that which they've lost. Jimmy Carter's chapter is a story for people that, the greatest thing that they did is their favorite job that they ever have, and they want it to last forever, and they can't. So how to turn being a former version of that into sort of a lifelong appointment. And then when I looked at the active living presidents, there was only one whose popularity had doubled, and he had accomplished that by investing less in his legacy than any of his active contemporaries, and that was George W. Bush. And so I wanted to understand how he had managed to do that.
So let's dive into some of these, some of the profiles that you've done individually, and again, because of our interest in what we do, focusing on foreign affairs in particular. So let me start with Herbert Hoover. So Adolf Hitler comes to power basically 1 month before Hoover leaves office. It's January 30th, March 4th, whatever it is. Hoover opposed American intervention in World War II. You write in the book, it's actually something I didn't know, that he had actually an audience with Hitler in 1938, just a few days before the Anschluss. And then, as you just mentioned, attempts to run for president again, actually 1940, doesn't really go anywhere. You even write how in the time between when he submitted his manuscript for his book and when the book actually went published, Pearl Harbor happened, and totally different environment in these ways. So tell us a little bit about how Hoover, as an ex-president or post-president, viewed the brewing crisis in Europe, what he thought America should and shouldn't do. And ultimately, it sounds like much of the America First committee folks, Pearl Harbor just on a dime kind of ended it. But I'd love for you to tell that story a little.
Yeah, first of all, it's interesting. With one of the things I also didn't quite appreciate, Hoover opposed the war, but he wasn't an isolationist. Right? He didn't oppose the war because he was an isolationist. It had more to do with his Quaker mentality and sort of his abhorrence for war in general. But he actually did not think America should be isolationist from Europe or from these conflicts. He actually, and because he had led famine relief for Europe after World War I, he understood very much that war was the easy part. The hard part was the aftermath of war. And that's really why he opposed it. So he occupied this kind of unique place that was in between the interventionist and the isolationist cause. And I think history sometimes pegs him as an isolationist, which is not true. Look, after he's voted out of office, he's very similar to Jimmy Carter in the sense that he has no intention of being a quiet ex-president. What he says is democracy is a harsh employer, and he's going to cool off for a year. And then he's going to figure out what he wants to say. And that's basically what he does. And and look, he looks at FDR and he thinks collectivism and the New Deal are a disaster for American society, because he, as an orphan who became a self-made millionaire, he thought that he had a very strong belief and a very strong conservative belief that collectivism is the enemy of mobility. And collectivism takes away something extraordinary about America, which is the ability for a meritocratic society to yield mobility, something which he certainly benefited from. So he writes a lot about that. And as war is brewing in Europe, he's deeply unpopular in the US. His own party treats him like a leper. The Democrats, they just continue to make fodder of his name. FDR may as well have ran against Herbert Hoover in 1936. And so he goes to Europe in 1938. It's the only place where he's still popular. He's beloved in Europe. I mean, he fed the entire continent, after World War I. And so he goes and sees kings and queens and prime ministers and presidents and gets kind of ticker tape parades wherever he goes. He goes to Germany in 1930 on that 1938 trip with no intention of seeing the Fuhrer or any of the senior Nazi leadership. He goes to see civil society, and he was a big proponent of civil society his whole life. He called them these benevolent institutions. And so when he's in Germany, he gets summoned by the Fuhrer to come see him. And so he goes and he has an audience with the Fuhrer. In the book, you'll see a photograph of him, with Adolf Hitler, somewhere in the middle. And he writes about that experience. And Hoover is trying to get him to speak ill of Roosevelt, which he won't do. And then Hoover starts talking about democracy. And he talks about how as soon as he mentions the word democracy, it just triggered Hitler. And Hitler just starts going ballistic. And he sort of describes him as an exhibitionist with weird hair, like utterly brilliant, but clearly mentally unstable and essentially a terrifying man. And so he leaves Hitler's office, and then he gets summoned by Goering. So he goes to see Goering, and he describes Goering as an even more terrifying psychopathic human being, and he's trying all the same tactics that Hitler had done as well. And then literally a matter of single-digit days later, the Germans march into Austria and Anschluss happens. Herbert Hoover is the only American president to meet Adolf Hitler. What I find extraordinary is, the FDR people had such disdain for Hoover that, here we are on the precipice of America joining World War II. Europe is on the precipice of the onset of war, which hadn't happened yet. Appeasement is breaking down, and nobody asks. The only person who understands what it's like to be president understands what it's like to deal with the consequences of war, and has also met Adolf Hitler. Nobody asks him for a briefing. Nobody reaches out to him to ask about the nature of the conversation, for a readout of the conversation. The intelligence community doesn't, engage Herbert Hoover to even understand, is there anything that we can learn from this? It's, to me, one of the most extraordinary omissions. And it's just because the FDR people hated him so much. And by the way, it's interesting. Bernard Baruch, one of FDR's advisors, suggests, after America enters the war, that maybe it would be a good idea to call on Herbert Hoover, again, because he's the only American who knows what it's like to be president and feed the world, to get his advice on, sort of the looming famine, problems. And FDR's response is, I'm not Jesus Christ. I'm not going to resurrect that man from the grave.
Well, politics still have a way of intervening even with post-presidency. So on that note, let me ask you about Jimmy Carter. So Carter, somewhat like Hoover, ends his presidency very unpopular, very unhappy. The way you put it, clearly has intent to be active, let's say, in his post-presidency, including a lot around the world, humanitarian issues, diplomatic issues. And you have some great examples in the books, and because he's a living president, I'm sure many of us can remember them, about how nearly every single one of Carter's successors become quite frustrated with him gallivanting around the world on some of these issues. And so my question here is, you tell some of those stories if you like, but my question here is, how do presidents whose purview on foreign affairs, as you mentioned before, is much greater, obviously, how do they actually best handle some of their predecessors that, let's say, some might say going rogue, and others might say are, committed and industrious and, care about the future of the country? But how do they actually handle those relationships?
So if you go back to the Hamilton quote or question from Federalist 72 about what to do with ex-presidents, we kind of get our answer, with Jimmy Carter, of what do we make of ex-presidents, which is Carter shows us they can either be partners to their successors, or they can be tremendous annoyances to their successors, right? He represents, his 42 plus year post-presidency represents the best, and in my opinion, even some of the worst of what ex-presidents can do, because they have a stature. They do have power. Carter shows that an ex-president has power. They get access, they have a voice, they have a following, They can influence domestic politics. They can influence international politics. They can confuse countries that are not democracies and don't understand the one president at a time principle. And just to give you an example with Carter, right? So look, there's no. I think Jimmy Carter's presidency, post-presidency, doesn't exist without Herbert Hoover's post-presidency. Carter does in a lot of respects what Hoover does. Hoover is a partner and a nuisance to all of his successors. He, does amazing things and problematic things in his post-presidency. He writes prolifically. He uses his voice. He plays the role of elder statesman, et cetera. What Carter does that Hoover didn't do is he built infrastructure around it, right? He built a post-presidential administration around it, and that was the platform. He created a platform. He turned the post-presidency into an institution. Herbert Hoover did not. Herbert Hoover showed the power and status and usefulness of an ex-president. Carter turned it into an institution. And so some of his good works, look, the guy basically cured guinea worm from this planet. I mean, it's an extraordinary public health achievement. You look at what he's done for election monitoring and human rights around the world. Extraordinary work. You look at what he's done for Habitat for Humanity, extraordinary work. And by the way, when George H.W. Bush, calls on him to go monitor the elections in Panama, when they're trying to prevent Noriega from, anointing his chosen narco successor, Jim Baker has the idea, to send Carter to Panama for really, one reason, which is, all evidence suggests that if you don't make use of Jimmy Carter, he's going to try to make use of himself in ways that are unproductive. And so they send him to Panama. But he takes, Gerald Ford with him, and they end up being quite useful. It was the same thing in the Reagan administration. When Sadat is killed, they send Carter because they need to send somebody, and it's better to engage. They have a view that it's better to engage Carter and make use of him than to have him sitting idle. I think when they sent him to go meet the hostages from Iran, I think that was a different situation. I think they I don't think Reagan particularly wanted to take an international trip on day one, but I think they felt like it was appropriate for Carter to do that. But I think they also felt like getting Carter out of the country in the first couple of days had its utility as well. But to give you some counterexamples, Carter, when George H.W. Bush is, getting ready to launch Operation Desert Storm, which, by the way, I'll remind you, is probably still to this day the best example of the UN doing collective action the right way to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. Carter decides that the war shouldn't happen, and he takes it upon himself to write to 3 of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, urging them to go against the United States. He didn't include Margaret Thatcher because he didn't trust her. And he gets snitched on by the Prime Minister of Canada, who tips off George H.W. Bush, right? And it's a abhorrent thing for an ex-president to do. When he decides that he wants to go to the Korean Peninsula in 1994 to personally resolve the nuclear crisis, Bill Clinton decides, it's just better to bring the guy into the tent. So he calls Carter to the White House, and he says, I understand you want to go to North Korea. I'm going to send you there as a messenger. Here's what I want you to communicate to Kim Il-sung. And what happens? Bill Clinton turns on CNN and finds Jimmy Carter announcing that he's just negotiated a new nuclear deal on the Korean Peninsula, right? And when Carter's asked about it later, he said, look, I kind of had no intention all along of ever just being a messenger. And his deep sense of faith is part of what, he says that, my faith, when he left office, my faith compels me to do whatever I can for as long as I can, in whatever way I can, for as long as I can. And he never really cared about what his successors thought. He didn't have a close relationship with a single one of his successors. And it's interesting, Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush became strange bedfellows. George W. Bush and, the Obamas, strange bedfellows. Carter and Ford a little bit, but not, they didn't develop that warm relationship. And by the way, they were both ex-presidents, so it was different. Carter never developed that with a sitting president. And look, if you look at peace, not apartheid, as an example, I like this example because it shows that while ex-presidents aren't accountable to voters, they are accountable to the court of public opinion. And that book went too far. And he lost some of his popularity and he lost some of his influence, and he got some of it back, but I don't think he ever got it fully back. And so that's the check and balance on ex-presidents and their influence, which is the court of public opinion.
The way in which you're talking about some of these presidents, their post-presidential term, it almost sounds like you're talking about vice presidents, which is sort of like they have some power, but not really, and you kind of want to keep them at arm's length, but you also want to trot them out when useful. Kind of an interesting cuts it there. So last one on this, and then I'll have a couple other questions, and there's some questions that came in through the chat that I'll ask too. George W. Bush. So you're frankly, in which the way you write the chapter, your admiration for Bush, I think, is just comes out really through the chapter. As you mentioned, you spent a lot of time with him for this book. You worked in his administration, and in many ways, his post-presidency is the antithesis, as you kind of mentioned, of Carter's. He still remains dedicated to some of the issues that defined his presidency: freedom and democracy, supporting dissidents in dark places. So my question here is, how does a post-president help sustain or husband or shepherd a set of ideas?
Yeah.
A lot of what you mention and talk about in the book is what is the individual dedicated to. But it seems like George W. almost has sort of said, I'm not a lot of public appearances, not a lot of direct weighing into things. Found obviously this personal purpose in his painting, in his artwork.
Yeah,
he still cares quite a lot about these broader sets of ideas. And so, how have they played roles in how to sustain those things over time that somebody else might pick up that baton or lead that movement?
Yeah, so the George W. Bush chapter had the potential to be the Achilles heel for this book. I was fortunate in the sense that I have great admiration for George W. Bush. My editor does not have admiration for George W. Bush, and that was actually a very useful relationship. And I told President Bush, I said, look, I'm not going to write a puff piece. And frankly, your story is not served well by doing that, because I'm going to lose all the people that don't like you. And what I wanted, and I said, I genuinely admire your ability to move on. And the chapter is called Moving On, right? And I genuinely want to understand how a man who's invested so little in his legacy has blown past all the presidents that have invested a ton in their legacy. I think that's a worthy study. And so the chapter is written in a way where I make it very clear this chapter is meant to understand that. It's to understand two things. Psychologically, how do you move on? Because out of 45 men who served as president 46 times, the only one who I believe has achieved happiness and who is completely detached from his time in politics and moved on from it and is not at all introspective about it is George W. Bush. And his critics, I say in the book, his critics will hate this, but it's still worthy of a study. It's a model, right? And so it's not meant to whitewash the presidency. It's not meant to it's not meant to kind of obfuscate, criticisms of his president. It's meant to understand this psychology and then how it translated into honestly achieving a better legacy while he's alive than any of his active contemporaries. And so there's a few things that I observe about Bush. One, the way I sort of describe him in the book is he's a chapter guy. It's just who he is, right? So he lives his life as chapters. So when I sat down to interview him, the first thing he said to me, he said, look, when it's over, it's over. I don't miss it. And the next sentence in the book is I actually believe him after spending time with him, which is, politics was a chapter in his life. And when it was done, he closed the book on it and didn't look back. He didn't reflect on it. He wasn't introspective about it. He didn't want to settle old scores about it. He wrote a history of it because that's kind of what comes with the post-presidential obligation. And he kind of got a kick out of the fact that people thought he never read a book, let alone could write one. But he closed that book on his chapter and then opened a new chapter. And so that's part one, sort of like understanding and he's a very disciplined human being, so that's why he's able to do it. And and that dovetails with his absolute reverence for the Washington principle of one president at a time. Other presidents have revered that principle, but they've not been able to resist the urge to dip their toe in the water. He doesn't campaign. He doesn't show up at the convention to give a speech. He doesn't like he does not participate in politics. And he tells me one story about being at a campaign event for his brother Jeb, where he privately said he didn't like Ted Cruz, and that ended up in the public domain. And he described that as a huge error and deviation, and he described it as cringeworthy. So he's disciplined in never mentioning his successors by name and truly staying out of politics under any circumstances. And I think Americans actually respect and admire that reverence for the Washington principle, and I think it's aged well in the era of Trump, to be blunt. So that's the second thing. The third thing is he's managed to find a way to, because he still cares about stuff. He cares about there's policies he cares about. He cares about PEPFAR, cares about veterans, cares about public health. He cares about freedom and democracy and human rights. He's found a post-presidential voice that allows him to advocate for those things without undermining his successors, that Americans appreciate. And yes, he's got the Bush Center and he does some of it through that. But I think it's this painting that, endears him to the American people, and the figures that he's painting, veterans and American immigrants, it reminds Americans that they actually always viewed him as the guy that they'd probably enjoy spending time with, even if they didn't like his presidency. But it's reminding them also that, there's some aspects of his presidency that were really, that were not all bad for his critics. And then look, he's been a painter now longer than he was ever a politician. And it's given him this endless learning experience that is contributing to his longevity. He's not going to write, 40 books like Herbert Hoover and Jimmy Carter. That's not what he's going to do. But he's going to paint until the end of his life. And he says, look, eventually my knees will give out and I won't be able to do the mountain biking with the veterans. Eventually, I'll end up in a wheelchair, and eventually I'll end up with a paintbrush, attached to a thing on my head. But he's like, this is something that will keep me learning and keep me ambitious, channel my ambition until the end of life. And so look, I have a piece out on the Fox, featured on the Fox News homepage today. The title of the piece is called "George W. Bush is winning ... the post-presidency." And he's winning because, again, he's found that happiness. And we had a lot of conversations about legacy. He has a very interesting view of it, which is he has a very quarrelsome view of the whole concept of investing in your legacy. It's not that he doesn't think legacy matters, and it's not that he doesn't care about it, but he quarrels with the idea and just cannot fathom the idea that somebody would waste time in the present or sacrifice the present to try to achieve something that they're not going to be around to see. And he tells me, he's like, look, I read 3 books about George Washington last year. If they're still writing about the other George by the time they get around to me, I'm going to be long gone. And instead of having dinner with my friends and family and learning something new and enjoying life, when there's not a ton of it left, I'm going to focus on my legacy. Right? He genuinely can't get his head around why somebody would do that. And honestly, you listen to him describe it, you're like, that makes a heck of a lot of sense.
So I'm going to combine a couple questions that come into the chat. So there are 5 living former presidents, plus obviously the current one. Of the 6 of them, 1 is a member of the greatest generation, Jimmy Carter. 4 are baby boomers who are all roughly the same age, basically. And the one who's not in all of that is Barack Obama. And seems like a very healthy individual. It's very possible that his post-presidency may be one of the longest that we have ever had, or even potentially the longest by the time he's done with it. He's not somebody that you profiled in the book, that you chose to profile in the book. My own assessment is that he remains an active force in politics, but maybe he hasn't quite found the purpose in the way that you talk about. So I'm curious of what's your take on that assessment, and is that somebody you considered going into, and why not?
So I considered Obama, and I drew a couple of conclusions. One, I reflected on what will likely be a very long post-presidency, and I looked at some of the ones that I wrote about and how long it took them to achieve that which was worth writing about. William Howard Taft doesn't achieve his dream of becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court until his final 10 years of life, right? As we've discussed, Herbert Hoover doesn't get the platform of service back until 12 years of self-imposed political exile. John Quincy Adams enters the House of Representatives a couple of years after he leaves office, and it takes him time to like have the cause of abolitionism overtake him. He sort of stumbles into it, right? It takes George W. Bush time to discover painting and really kind of own it, not as a hobby, but a true passion and an incredibly meaningful part of this last chapter of life. And I could sort of go on. And so my view is Barack Obama's chapter as a post-president is still too early to evaluate, because he has not found that sense of purpose yet. He is active. He's sort of stuck in this middle between being a quiet ex-president, but just unhelpfully inserting himself at different times. You can see when presidential elections come about, like he feels relieved to just be able to say all the things that he wants to say. It must have been very painful to him during the COVID election not to be able to like have the big crowds and have to wear a mask and all these things. I think he hasn't figured out his sense of purpose yet, right? I think there's things he cares about. He's going to live a long time. He's busying himself with, the things that are kind of both the obligations and the perks of the post-presidency, which are the high-paid speeches, now the sort of Spotify deals, the library, the private jets, all that stuff. But like that's not unique to him. They all do that now. I believe he will eventually find some sense of purpose. The question is it going to be something worth writing about that makes him a peer of this group? Too early to know.
So another question that came in, and I'll paraphrase it a little bit differently, but how has the democratization of media, and by that I think that the concept here is social media, cheap video, et cetera, how has that changed the post-presidency? And again, not now I'm ad-libbing, which is the ability to continue to have a platform and one that is accessible to people in a way that's totally different than 25 years ago, and obviously 150 years ago. So in your mind, is that a fundamental change? And if so, how do you expect that to play out into the future?
Yeah, it's funny, the George W. Bush transition was interesting. I interviewed one of his daughters about this, and she was telling me, she reminded me that, the whole social media thing happened while he was president, right? And, he was the last president not to have like at the time, a BlackBerry or a smartphone. So he left office and like the whole media environment had changed. And so, he had this sort of moment where, he gave a mint to Michelle Obama, if you remember this, and it went viral. And like, he didn't even understand the concept of going viral. And it actually was interesting for him. It showed him that, the symbolism of an ex-president can be a valuable statement in and of itself if you choose your moments carefully. And he sort of walked me through a few of those moments. And he sort of used the mint as an example. He used, the former presidents standing together at the President's Cup as an example. It's sort of the symbolic effect of it. And I think he came to understand that because of what social media could do. It makes his discipline that much more remarkable because it's much harder to sort of have private moments and public moments in today's environment. But look, what it does is it makes this idea of ex-presidents or celebrities. I mean, look at Trump. Trump is really the first ex-president to make use of social media as an asset for his cause, right? And his cause is, more of the Grover Cleveland comeback, right? That's like by all, I think the difference is Cleveland lost the electoral vote in 1888, but he didn't lose the popular vote. He lost the election because he stood on principle against a high tariff that he thought the country didn't need. And he'd actually never been happier than when he threw away the presidency, and he wanted to stay as an ex-president. He only comes back in 1892 because he believes he's the only Democrat who can defeat the Republican incumbent, Benjamin Harrison, who just signed the first $1 billion budget, who he believed was marching the country towards entanglements and greater imperialism. And he worried about, cheap money winning out over sound money and thought the US was going to ruin itself by jumping off the gold standard. And that's why he comes back. And by the way, so he wins the popular vote 3 times. When he leaves the presidency the second time, in 1897, and McKinley becomes president, somebody asks him, what should we do with ex-presidents? And, he says, look, ex-presidents should be taken out to a 5-acre lot and shot. And then he decides, you know what, in second thought, a 5-acre lot is far too big and a former president has suffered way too much. So he's less popular and less happier than he's ever been in his life. But Trump has really figured out, you know, how to take social media as a platform and combine that with what Jimmy Carter understood, which is how to use the ex-presidency as a status, and merge those two together to pursue the Grover Cleveland model of a comeback.
It's fascinating, the fact that we're living through it. All right, final question from me, and you can take it either as a softball or really wrestle with it. So we are likely headed for our, I think it's 7th general election presidential rematch in our history. It's 7. It'll likely be the 7th time that the same two candidates have faced off each other twice. One of these two, given that their age, will likely have a post-presidency in 2025. Maybe one of them will run a third time, although again, given their age, I would be skeptical. And their post-presidency isn't likely to last very long. And so if either of them were to actually read your book, what would you want each of them to actually take away from it?
Well, I don't think they'd like what I want them to take away from it, which is—
That's the better answer. You
right?
should.
So if you look at this, so again, if 1892 was the only other time that you had a presidential rematch, circumstances were, of course, very different. It shows you that this is the anomaly, not the norm in terms of the evolution of our political system. So that's one way that we've gone off script from what I think Hamilton and the founders would have wanted. A second way that we've gone off script is we have the two oldest candidates in history running against each other, eclipsed only by themselves from 4 years ago. And we're in that situation because you have two presidents that don't want to give up power, or at least that's part of it, right? They have lots of other narratives, but it is a fact that Biden doesn't want to give up power, and it is a fact that Trump doesn't want to give up power. They have other things at stake as well, but that's true. And now and the third thing is, now that we're in this situation, the honest truth is, because you know Trump will be in his 80s if he wins, and Biden is already well into his 80s before the election. This is not just presidential rematch 2024, Biden versus Trump, who will be the next president. This is Biden versus Trump, who will be the next ex-president. And the reason that matters is there won't really be a post-presidency, right? The one thing that I will say about each of these, so if you look at Thomas Jefferson, at 82 years old, he finally achieves the 3rd volume of his life trilogy, which is to found an arts and sciences university so that the next generation can be trained in civic virtues, divorced from theology, so they can iterate on the flaws left behind by the founders and ensure the republic survives. But Jefferson had been hard at work on founding that university from even before he became president of the United States, and he worked on it for the entirety of his post-presidency. Neither Biden nor Trump have, Trump's post-presidency has been defined by getting the presidency back. Biden hasn't contemplated a post-presidency yet. There's not enough time for them to do something meaningful with it. Whereas had they both given up power, prior, they may have had a shot at making use of the ex-presidency or the post-presidency. So I don't think they would like any of the prescriptions from my book. I mean, I suppose, Trump would like the idea that, he'd be the only president other than Cleveland to make a comeback, and perhaps he'd accomplish something that no other president had accomplished, which is losing the popular vote and the electoral college and getting the presidency back despite both of those. But no, I don't think either of them would like it.
Well, I do hope they read it nonetheless. So, Jared Cohen, Life After Power. Thank you. Congratulations on the book. And the only thing I'll close on is I think history is always a product of actually the moment that you're in. So I'll be curious that in 30 years, when you write the revised edition, whether your own take on these actual 7 will actually be different.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.